So it's great to be back. And one thing about speaking here, it's like I don't have to go through any big long exploration or explanations about collective consciousness, oneness. We're all kind of swimming in the same ocean of understanding. So the subject that I've been thinking a lot about lately and have actually been studying with some people who pay attention to this kind of activity is what's called subtle activism. Now, most of us know about activism, out there kind of activism, but when we expand our awareness to the fact that we are all one thing, and to whatever degree this resonates, that there are many more dimensions of reality than just this one, that we live in a very large collective, we begin to run into possibilities for meeting life experiences or collective situations with this idea of what's called subtle activism, which is all of us, well, or many of us in different groups working together towards certain outcomes from the inside out rather than from the outside in. One of the really powerful pieces of thinking about doing meditative or prayer-based or energy-based activism, work towards certain outcomes, is to be aware of the metaphysical principle that what we fight, we feed. So this gets to be kind of an interesting dilemma of how do you work toward a goal without joining hate and struggle and all of those resonances that aren't going to get you where you want to go. This brings us to a really important piece of the thought of moving into subtle activism, where we're joining together to nurture certain outcomes. And that is the whole idea of frequencies. So in my wackadoodle world, which is not so wacky to all of you folks, so it's not so hard to talk about this, but in the world I was raised in, reality was presented as being highly multidimensional based on different frequencies. So my grandmother, who saw a lot of these different frequencies, to her the world was a very much bigger place than it is for me in my perception. But it was a matter of her ability to see at different frequencies. She wasn't limited to the five senses and to our three-dimensional reality. The other thing, by the way, I was raised with, but a lot of you have this as probably part of your world paradigm at this point, if not when you were young, that we are actually never alone, that in this idea of different frequencies and different dimensions of being, we're always potentially, if not actually, collaborating with energies, beings, frequencies that are not perceived in the general culture. There's a man who's really interesting to listen to, and I probably mentioned him last time I was here. His name is Claude Poncelet. He is a nuclear physicist who is also a shaman. And Claude is very open about his shamanic work with the invisible realms, and it very much goes into the arena of subtle activism. What he does that I really like, and I recommend it if you're going to do this kind of inner work, he always, first of all, acknowledges that there are other forces available and working with him. And he always enters into a visible, invisible realm collaboration with the underlying intention that whatever emerges will serve the most harmonious outcome for all concerned. And this is a key piece around subtle activism, how to hold an intention that doesn't become deeply personal in the sense of limited to what outcomes we might be able to imagine. So one of the pieces above and beyond what we fight, we feed, is to also say, am I holding a wished for outcome that is broad enough to meet the harmonious outcome of all concerned. In thinking about subtle activism, how to resist without fighting, because we give energy to things that we fight. And I think one of the things that has been sad for me to see is that the discourse currently, at least in this country, it keeps devolving, and everybody keeps jumping in and moving the discourse into less and less respectful interactions, and that energy probably doesn't lead to the outcomes we're hoping for. There's a man named David Spangler, for those of you who may never have heard of him. David was part of the early time at Findhorn, and he's a mystic who's been teaching forever. And recently, like over the last 7 years or so, David decided to come out more about his mystical process. So he's doing a lot of online webinars, and he has a publication called Views from the Borderland, which are what he calls his field notes of collaborating with the invisible realms. And David has a really powerful caution that I appreciate. Let's say we're thinking about leaders, or we're thinking about some situation that's very sticky and we may have a lot of feelings about it. He invites us to send light to the people involved, but the light he's talking about isn't, gee, I hope they wake up, or I hope it is free of any personal urgency or agenda. The light he's talking about is the energy that remembers the sacred. That what we're doing is bathing people in an energy that will remember the sacred in them. We're not looking for outcome when we're doing this kind of work. And subtle activism is most often done in a group of some kind, either a meditation group or a prayer group. Prayer is actually a form of subtle activism, for sure. And when you join together, you're creating an energy that can nurture more positive outcomes. The thing I often keep in mind when I'm engaging in or pondering subtle activism is how many people around the world are doing the same things, and that we join together when we go inside and we hold a certain frequency of awareness or a certain outcome. We're joining with lots and lots and lots of other people. And that creates kind of a global field of resonance around the kind of energy we're putting into the subtle activism that we're doing. There's a subtle activism group that I've been leading for quite a while, but I'm never public about the things I do. So I thought I would at least tell you it exists. At www.devadana, DEVADANA, sanctuary.com. By October 1st of this year, I'll have up the phone call information. It's a once a month phone call where people call in and we do a guided meditation together on whatever we're focusing on. And I generally invite us to focus on outcomes that may have to do with awakening compassion in the heart of humanity as a whole. A lot of subtle activism works in larger issues. So I might invite us to energize or hold as possible that the heart of humanity as a whole species will have its compassion more available. Something like that. It can be, we can focus subtle activism on absolutely anything. The key is to not put a lot of personal pressure in it, because then you're giving it a frequency that, for me, tends to constrict rather than expand and reach into the greatest possibility that people will resonate with what we're sending. Also, I very much sense and call on non-physical, non-human support for this subtle activism. Now, it can depend on what you experience as non-human support. Some people think of angels. In my world, I was raised to think of beings who are called devas, which in Sanskrit means shining ones, who are working with us in the way I was raised all the time. I'm not sure anymore what I believe is actually real, because I think reality is bigger than anything my human brain can encompass. But just to have a paradigm to work with without holding on to it too tightly. Because I think if we're open to the amazing, amazing qualities that reality has to offer us, it's the potentials are much vaster than we carry around in our everyday consciousness. So for me, subtle activism is actually a very powerful option for those of us who may not be out in the front lines resisting or going to meetings or what people do when they want to create certain outcomes. One of my favorite forms of subtle activism is a Buddhist practice called Tonglen. Now, for those of you who know it, you know how powerful a practice this is. For those of you who aren't so familiar with it, Pema Chodron does some amazing teaching around Tonglen. But the basics of it are that your heart space holds a fire, the fire of love, that is really, really powerful. What lives in this heart space is kind of amazing, and our culture doesn't appreciate the heart as an organ of intelligence. It's starting to, because we're learning more and more about how we're really constructed. But this heart space is a much more powerful brain than your head brain. It perceives things in a way the head brain can't. They work together, and we wouldn't want to be without either one. But the fire in the heart is no joke. It's very powerful, and what I've been asking people to do is to be aware that the condition of our species everywhere, this is not just a problem that we're having where we live, everywhere, fear and hatred are driving the species. So what I've been asking people to do, although it might sound a little scary at first, is to spend a little time each day breathing in hatred and fear, letting the fire burn it up and neutralize it, and breathing out love and compassion or ease and peace, recognizing that in a very weird way, and this is something I've thought for a lot of years, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, but energetically to me it does. I think of us as energy oysters. Now, oysters filter water. I don't know if any of you saw it on Facebook. There was a spectacularly good example of this, of a man who was farming oysters, and he had a bunch of them in a tank, and he was saying we ought to have oysters in every waterway, really, at this point, wherever they can survive. And this tank had water in it that was so dark you couldn't see the oysters. And then I don't know whether it was a couple of hours later, sometime later, there was that same tank with totally clear water. So I think of us energetically in the same way. Since we are in a consciousness that is only one thing, and we're all affecting each other all the time, when we do something like breathing in fear and hatred and breathing out whatever, ease, love, compassion, we are literally filtering our collective consciousness. And I started to get curious, what if a critical mass of us actually did that every day? And what might that allow the heart of humanity as a species to start to be willing to feel about encountering each other? It seems to me, and I mentioned this last time I was here, that our species, it feels anyway, is at a developmental point in our maturation process, if we could call it that yet, to begin to make a choice between living in a world where we cling to an idea of separateness, which means I can make someone an other. I don't have to know that we're all the same thing. Or what if we began to live more deeply within the assumption of oneness, that there is no other anywhere, and nothing is happening anywhere that isn't who we are, that we aren't part of it. For anybody, any species, anything, anywhere, that there is not even the possibility of having an other. So if you buy that, then anything you or I or any of us do affects everybody all at once. It's one of the things that has helped me as a trauma specialist in doing the work I do, that first of all, I never work alone. If I'm in this collective, I can draw on the wisdom of everybody who's done this work and their wisdom and their creativity, but also any healing that happens with any one of us, any chance any risk that we take, any stretch we make, any deepening that we do touches everybody, and everybody else who's healing touches us. So we're doing a big collective dance together. We're never separated out. I remember one time I was in my office and the computer was irritating me. I don't let this happen anymore, but that day this computer was really getting the better of me, and I slammed my hand down on my desk and let out some wonderful noise. No doubt, I'm glad it's not recorded. But immediately I thought, oh, I cannot do that here. The spirit of this office did not like that. And I immediately apologized, and I realized it mattered what I was exploding out. Even though there was no one there, there was a lot of something there. This is the other thing Claude does that I love so much, and it matches how I was raised, and it was very relieving to read his work, because I thought, oh, here's like a nuclear physicist who is doing similar stuff, and it was very, it made me feel so happy that he's so upfront about his multidimensionality. So he was, he did a series through Sounds True, and Tammy Simon, who runs Sounds True, had said to him somewhere along the way in this recorded interview, I recommend it, by the way, it's on YouTube. It's a 2-part audio interview with Tammy Simon at Sounds True. And she said, when you came, we felt like there was something a little different in the room. We couldn't tell what it was. What did you do? And he said, well, of course, before I even came, I tuned in on the spirit of Sounds True to say hello, to thank it for having me and that we were going to be collaborating. He said, then when I got here, of course, I tuned in on the spirit of the room, and of course, I tuned into the conference room table and all the chairs. I said hello to all of them, asked them to collaborate with all of us for a harmonious outcome. And I thought, wow, that is so good to hear, because I was taught that there's always a spirit wherever you are. So this room has a spirit that embodies it, and it's part of what unfolds here. Our homes have a spirit of our home. When I go to my office, I say good morning to the office every morning. I thank it every afternoon for another day of healing. I do the same at home. I have a little altar at home right when you walk in the door, just to honor that my home is embodied as a safe place, as a sanctuary. So when we think of subtle activism, there are many, many ways to approach it. But it asks us to remember we are not a single isolated organism moving around, and that we may have more power than we realize. That the key is to think about frequencies and to be able to check in through the day and see what frequency you're resonating with at any given moment. It was after I slammed my hand down on the desk, the frequency I was resonating with did not feel good or right in that place. It wouldn't be good anywhere, but it was so vividly not in line with the energy that the office embodies. if any of you know Muji is a spiritual teacher. I want to show you what he has people do, but I have to put the microphone here. Okay.
There's a mic stand over there. Mic stand.
Aha. So let me put this here for half a second. Oh, excellent. So what he says is, as you're going through the day, and this is a way to come back to a frequency that you want to maintain. He says, just do this. Just be with this for a moment or two. You don't even have to think any content. And your body will settle back in. Right? Hard to be agitated when you're doing this. Right? And isn't this part of our collective being? It's not a Western posture, but we know it. We know it because it's part of our species posture, right? I always recommend to people, when you want to have a particular quality of frequency as you're going through your day or your month or your year, it helps sometimes to have, like, there's this body posture or an image or a color, a sound, a word that helps you return to the frequency you want. My very old iPad, I have relationships with gadgets. I mean, I am one of those people who thinks all of this stuff is alive, so I make relationships with everything I'm around. And my very, very old iPad, it is really old, somehow out of somewhere, and I have no idea how it happened except I downloaded an app, but I have no, at 8 a.m. a Tibetan bowl rings. And it's like, oh, when I'm around to hear it, it just settles me. When I was recently in Bermuda, which is an hour different, it started ringing at 8 o'clock there. I came home and it did it at 9 o'clock for a day or two, and then somehow it caught up with itself and it went back to 8 o'clock. And I'm afraid to even touch the app because I have no idea how that got there and I don't want it to go away. But I think that as wacky as it may sound, having relationships with everything as alive enriches your life. And it also enriches, I think, when we realize that we have a presence and something we can do all the time in collective consciousness. For me, Tonglen allows me to feel like I'm doing something when I'm not out able to do more active somethings. And you can breathe Tonglen on absolutely anything, but it's knowing, wait a minute, I can take a moment and actually contribute right now. Even if I have to go to work and I'm locked in my office all day, I can contribute. I can come back to this between sessions and do 2 breaths and offer something. So I want to just make sure I haven't forgotten anything. You're also already in this space, that there's a lot I don't have to say, but let me read to you. I want to read to you a couple of statements from, I think I've told you everything I absolutely needed to. Yeah. Let me read to you. There's a woman named Sandra Ingerman. She's a shamanic teacher. And I'm going to ask you to kind of feel inside as I read these words and see what they say to you, because I think in these quotations I want to read you, she is calling us to an amazing, challenging practice, which I'll talk about when I read this, because it's like, okay. Being conscious is the necessity we have at this time for all of us collectively. So here is what she has to say about what I would call subtle activism. She says, to change the collective fabric requires changing our thoughts and daydreams. As we work to create a new fabric of reality in the invisible realms, it will manifest into the physical world to replace all that is unraveling. In this way, we build an invisible world of substance that manifests as a new physical reality. When we use our thoughts, words, and daydreams to build an invisible world of substance, we go to the core of reweaving a new fabric of reality. If we collectively hold a new vision for the future, we discover the power to shape these changes positively. Tracking your daydreams, that's a constant mindful process, a big one. Well, let me say one more thing and then I will wrap up. When you don't know what to do with subtle activism, you could begin to call on optimal futures without knowing what they are. To reach into the world of probabilities and say, I want to nurture and bring into being an optimal future humanity and an optimal future Earth. Letting go of anything you think that will look like. Because I think after 30-something years of working with the optimal future self, I am absolutely convinced that we touch probabilities and have an active role in calling them into being. So when you sit down to do subtle activism, if you decide to, let yourself just call on optimal futures. Thank you very much.